The garage sat on the industrial edge of Millfield, behind a gravel lot that turned to mud when it rained. Jack Brennan opened the bay doors every morning at 6:15, and the smell of cutting oil and old rubber greeted him the same way it had for 11 years. He did not own the building, he leased it, and the rent was low enough that he never asked questions. Sophie turned 7 that spring. She ate oatmeal at the small desk in the corner of the office while Jack pulled the first work order. The desk had a telephone with a cord, a coffee maker that only worked if you held the button for 3 seconds, and a drawer full of her drawings that Jack had never thrown away. She watched him count out the sockets on his roll cart, and she knew the difference between a 13mm and a 15mm by the sound they made when he dropped them into the tray. The crew showed up between 6:45 and 7. Marcus handled transmissions and had a daughter Sophie's age. Eli ran the front office when he was not under a car. Dave and Colton did brakes and suspension, the detail work that Jack no longer had the patience for. They were men who showed up because they had families to feed, and Jack paid them every Friday in cash he pulled from a safe behind the parts rack. The shop was clean in the way that working garages are clean. Every tool had a shadow board, and every drain pan was emptied and wiped before close. Jack had learned the discipline from his own father, who had worked at a Chrysler plant in the 1970s and believed that a dirty shop was a lazy mind. Sophie knew this because Jack had told her once, and she had repeated it back to him while he was changing a fuel pump. He stopped what he was doing, looked at her, and decided she was old enough to hand him a wrench. Customers came to Brennan's because Jack could diagnose an engine by the way the starter dragged, and because he showed them the worn part before he quoted the job. He did not sell what was not broken. The reputation spread by word of mouth. The office had a window that looked out into the bay, and the glass was streaked with grease. Sophie pressed her face to it when she was bored, and she drew what she saw. Her drawing showed men under cars with wheels removed, and the wheels always looked like suns with rays of lug nuts. Jack kept them in the drawer, not because they were good, but because they were accurate. On the Thursday before everything changed, Jack finished a timing belt on a 2009 Camry and walked out to watch the sun drop behind the chain-link fence. He returned inside, wiped his hands on a rag that had been white 20 years ago, and told Sophie to get her coat. That evening he locked the side door once, the way he always did, and he drove home with his daughter asleep against the passenger window. Home was a rental house 3 miles east. Sophie had her own room with a bookshelf made from cinder blocks and a plank of pine that Jack had built when she was 4. They ate dinner at a folding table because the kitchen table had broken a leg 5 years ago and Jack had never replaced it. They did not talk about the future. They simply slept, and the garage waited for them in the dark. The representative arrived on a Tuesday morning in a charcoal suit that had never been near a shop floor. He walked through the bay doors without knocking, and his shoes made a sound on the concrete that Jack recognized immediately. It matched the sound of a man who had never had to kneel on gravel to reach a drain plug. The representative held a leather folder, and he asked for the owner in a voice that suggested he already knew the owner was not present in any way that mattered. Jack wiped his hands and stepped out from behind a Subaru that Marcus was pulling. The man introduced himself as a liaison for Vantage Properties, and he used the phrase performance covenant in the same tone that other men used for weather reports. The landlord had assigned the building's operating agreement to Vantage as part of a portfolio acquisition. The covenant allowed for immediate lease termination upon structural or financial underperformance. Vantage had classified the block as underperforming. Everyone on the industrial strip had 48 hours to clear their equipment and vacate the premises. Jack read the notice twice. The first time he read it for the meaning, and the second time he read it for the language. The words were precise, and they had been written by someone who had never stood in a garage and understood that a lift bolted to the floor was not equipment that could be cleared in 2 days. The man said Vantage was prepared to offer a nominal settlement for fixtures that couldn't be removed. He left a card on the parts counter and walked back out to a silver sedan that idled in the gravel lot with its air conditioning running. Marcus came over and read the notice without touching it, as if the paper might carry something contagious. Eli stood in the office doorway with his arms crossed, and Dave and Colton leaned against the fender of a Dodge waiting for a transmission service. Nobody spoke for a full minute, and the minute was broken by Sophie, who asked from the corner desk why the man in the suit had not wiped his feet. Jack almost laughed. He did not. He folded the notice and put it in the drawer with Sophie's drawings, because that was the only place in the office that felt safe. Jack told her the man was looking for directions. She accepted this because she was 7, and because she trusted him in the wordless, complete way that children trust the people who have never once given them a reason not to. She went back to her drawing, and Jack watched her fill in the spokes of a wheel with a blue crayon. He thought about the fact that the notice did not mention the secondary unit because the secondary unit was not on the lease. It was on a separate parcel that the original owner had deeded to him personally in exchange for a favor that had taken 3 weekends and a complete frame-off restoration of a 1967 Chevrolet pickup. The paperwork was in a folder in his truck glove compartment. The crew left over the course of the afternoon. Marcus shook Jack's hand and held it longer than usual. Jack walked them to the lot and told them he would call as soon as he knew what came next. He did not know what came next. He only knew that the garage had become his life, and the life had been ended by a man who had not wiped his feet. That evening, Jack sat in the dark garage with the bay doors closed and the overhead lights off. He sat on a rolling stool and looked at the lifts, the empty hoist chains, and the oil stains that had become part of the floor. Jack had left Sophie at a neighbor's house because he had called in a favor he had been saving for something else. He did not cry. He had not cried since his father died, and he was not going to start over a piece of paper. What he did instead was walk to the back of the building and open a door that he had not opened in 3 months. Behind the main bay stood a space that the Vantage survey team had apparently never measured. The door was steel, and the frame was rusted at the corners, and it opened with a key that Jack kept on the same ring as his truck ignition. Inside were 8 automotive chassis and body shells that he had collected over a decade from estate sales, salvage auctions, and a single consignment from a collector in Detroit who had died without heirs. Tarps covered them, faded to the color of dust, and they sat on wooden blocks that had compressed under the weight but had not yet cracked. Jack did not turn on the light. He stood in the doorway and smelled the particular silence of a space that had not been entered by anyone except him since the day he brought the last piece home. He had not opened it because there was no current work that required the space, and because opening it always made him think of his father, who had taught him that a chassis was the only honest part of a car. The body could lie, and the paint could hide rust, but the chassis was the skeleton, and it told the truth about every impact and every repair. Jack stood in the doorway and understood, for the first time since the representative had arrived, that he was not finished. Jack spent the first 24 hours doing what he always did when a problem seemed too large to approach directly. He worked. He finished the Subaru that Marcus had left on the lift, and he called the owner to say it was ready. He reassembled the front end of the contractor's F-150 that he had already fixed, and he drove it to the man's house because the shop was closing and there was no longer a safe place to leave the keys. He did these things because the motion of his hands was the only conversation he knew how to have with the world when words failed him. On the second day, he pulled every tarp in the secondary unit. He did not start with the chassis. He started with the tarps themselves, which were layered and tied with rope and coated with years of dust. He pulled the first one back slowly, the way you open something you're fairly certain is worth keeping, but can't afford to be wrong about. Underneath sat a 1954 Chevrolet 3100 frame with its cab separated and stored upright against the wall. The VIN plate was intact, and the frame rails were clean. Jack had bought it from a farmer in Wisconsin who was clearing his barn. The farmer had called it scrap. Jack had seen the frame rails and known that no quad bike ever built was worth more than those 2 pieces of steel. He pulled the second tarp and the third. 8 chassis and body shells arranged in 2 rough rows, every one of them covered and left in a building that a team had classified as an empty demolition target without ever once looking past the tarps. There was a 1968 Mustang fastback shell from an Ohio flood salvage, a 1932 Ford coupe body a widow had sold him for the price of towing, and a Studebaker frame Jack had found at a farm sale where the auctioneer had called it an old hay wagon chassis. Jack had been the only one who recognized the torque tube mounting points. He saw them not as a collection, but as 8 statements of fact. Each chassis recorded a specific decision made by a specific craftsman on a specific afternoon, and the preservation board had sought for 2 years to document heritage automotive coachwork in the region. Jack knew this because he had sat in a meeting 6 months earlier at the public library, where a woman in a corduroy jacket had explained the registry process. He had not thought his tarps qualified. Now he understood that they did, and he understood that a formal designation would freeze any demolition permit on the block until the review was complete. He made 2 calls. The first was to the preservation board. He told the woman in the corduroy jacket that he had better than photographs. He had the actual objects, the provenance, and the original bills of sale. The second call was to a broker named Linda, who handled distressed industrial sales. He told her he had a secondary unit with contents of potential historical interest, and that he was looking for a buyer who understood the value of things that couldn't be rushed. She asked if he had a price in mind. Jack said no. He told her he had terms in mind, and they would become clear when the right person sat down across from him. Linda said she knew exactly the type of buyer who would respond to a quiet listing. Jack told her that the buyer he wanted was the kind of person who looked at a man in a flannel shirt and saw a desperation they could exploit. Linda was quiet for a moment, and then she told him she would make the call. The diner was called Millfield Coffee and Grill, though nobody called it that. They called it the diner, or just the place on 4th, and it had been there since before the interstate redirected traffic away from the town center. The booths were red vinyl that had cracked at the seams and been repaired with duct tape the color of dried blood. Jack arrived 20 minutes early and chose the corner booth in the back because it was the only seat where he could see the door without being seen from the parking lot. He ordered coffee and did not touch it while it was hot. He watched the street through the window, and he watched the waitress wipe the counter in a pattern she no longer knew she was repeating. Her name was Ruth, and she had served Jack coffee on slow mornings for 6 years. She simply refilled his cup when it dropped below half full, and she did not charge him for the second pour. That was the kind of gesture that existed in places like this, and Jack understood that it was also the kind of gesture that disappeared when the block became heritage industrial chic. Victoria Cross arrived exactly at the time Linda had given him, and she arrived alone. She wore a white trench coat that Jack recognized as expensive because it did not wrinkle when she slid into the booth across from him. Her phone was in her hand before her coat was settled. She did not look at him. She looked at the menu, decided against it, and told the waitress she would have sparkling water. The waitress said they did not have sparkling water. Victoria looked up for the first time, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had just discovered that the world had failed to meet her standards. She sat across from him, and she did not put her phone down. She scrolled through something that Jack assumed was a schedule, or a set of acquisition targets, or perhaps a social feed that showed her a life even more curated than the one she was currently living. The phone was the barrier, and Jack let it stay up. He had no need to see her eyes yet. He needed her to see him first, and he needed her to see exactly what she expected to see. She looked at Jack, and she did not see him. She saw a man in a flannel shirt with grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully removed. She saw a seller who needed the money more than he needed the dignity of the transaction, and she relaxed in a way that Jack understood completely. He had seen that relaxation before, from customers who assumed that a mechanic who worked with his hands was a mechanic who couldn't read. He did not correct her assumption. He let it sit between them like a third guest at the table, and he waited for her to speak first because he knew she would. "I understand you have a storage unit on the industrial block," she said. "My company is clearing that entire strip for a mixed-use development. The unit is a minor acquisition, but I prefer to handle minor acquisitions personally. It prevents surprises." Jack nodded without speaking. He did not tell her that the surprise had already happened, and that she was sitting in it. "The previous tenant was a garage of some kind," she continued, and she waved her hand in a gesture that dismissed the entire category of work that Jack had performed for 11 years. "A mechanic shop, very dirty, very noisy, the sort of place that drags down property values and attracts the wrong kind of clientele. We terminated the leases under a performance covenant, standard procedure. The owner was apparently quite unhappy, But these things are never personal. They're simply the market correcting itself. Jack picked up his coffee and drank it. It had gone cold. He looked at Victoria Cross, and he thought about Marcus driving home to tell his daughter that he did not know where the next check was coming from. He let the anger go, and he held on to the facts. The fact that she did not recognize him, the fact that she had never walked into his garage, and the fact that she believed she was buying junk from a desperate stranger. These were not insults. They were advantages. The unit has some contents, Jack said. Old automotive pieces, frames, and body shells. I'm told they may have historical value. Victoria smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had just heard that a storage unit contained not scrap metal, but scrap metal with a story attached. She liked stories when they increased her acquisition advantage, and she did not like them when they complicated her timeline. Jack could see her calculating which category this fell into, and he could see her deciding that a man in a flannel shirt was not capable of telling a story that would complicate anything. Historical value is a flexible term, she said. I will have my team assess the contents. If there's value, we will incorporate it into the development's marketing story. Heritage industrial chic, very popular with the people we're targeting. You will be compensated fairly for the inconvenience of removal. Shall we say a flat fee for the unit and its contents, and you sign a release stating that you have no further claim to the property or any historical designation that might be attached to it. She slid a folded document across the table. It was 2 pages, and the text was small, and Jack did not open it. He simply looked at it, and then he looked at her, and then he reached into his shirt pocket and placed a photograph on the table between them. Jack watched her mouth move, and he watched her hands gesture in the air as if she were already designing the lobby of the building that would replace his shop. He watched her assume that the story of the unit belonged to her, and that his role was simply to accept the flat fee and sign the release and disappear into the background of a development she had already named in her head. He did not interrupt her, letting her finish, because the space between her last word and his first word was where the power was going to shift. The photograph was 4 by 6 inches, and it had been taken on a Saturday morning when Sophie was 6. She stood in the main bay of the garage holding a wrench that was too large for her hands, and she was grinning because Jack had just told her that the wrench was older than her grandmother. Behind her were the main bay doors, and above the doors was a painted sign that read, Brennan's Garage, in letters that Jack had hand-stenciled during his first year in the space. The paint was faded, but the name was readable, and the sign was still there because Jack had never taken it down. Victoria looked at the photograph, and she looked at Jack, and the recognition arrived slowly, then all at once. She was too controlled to gasp, but her hand stopped moving on the table, and Jack could see the exact moment when she understood. It was in her eyes first, a narrowing that was not anger, but calculation, and then it moved to her mouth, which pressed into a line that was thinner than the one she had worn when she walked in. She looked at the grease under his fingernails, and she looked at the flannel shirt, and she looked at the name on the sign behind Sophie, and she put the 3 images together in a sequence that she had not prepared for. You're the owner, she said. It was not a question. It was a statement that she needed to hear herself say out loud so that she could believe it. Jack nodded slowly. He did not smile, and he did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his pocket again and placed a second item on the table. It was a key. The key to the secondary unit, and the key to the only remaining structure on the block that she did not legally control. He placed it on top of the photograph, and the metal made a sound against the laminate table that was louder than either of them had expected. The sound was small, but it carried the weight of a door being unlocked, and both of them understood that the door was not just physical. I did not come here to sell you scrap, Jack told her. I came because your surveyors missed a door, and because the contents behind that door are no longer just my problem. They're yours. Victoria looked at the key, and then she looked at the photograph, and then she looked at Jack with an expression that was trying to become anger, but had not yet found its footing. She was a woman who had built her career on controlling the information in a room, and she had just lost control of the 2 most important pieces of information in this booth. She had assumed both were negligible, and she was now realizing that she had assumed wrong. She tried to recover the posture she had arrived with. She straightened her back, and she picked up her phone and she looked at the screen as if it contained an answer that would make the photograph and the key disappear. It did not. She set the phone down again, and she looked at Jack. and for a moment the booth was silent except for the diner's background noise, which suddenly seemed very loud. "How did you get my contact information?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a person who was holding something heavy and did not want to drop it. "I answered your broker's inquiry," Jack replied. "You were looking for a desperate seller. I'm the only seller you have found, and I'm not desperate. I'm also not your employee, and I'm not bound by your 48-hour timeline. I have all the time I need, and your project doesn't." Victoria opened her mouth to reply, and then she closed it. She looked at the key again, and she looked at the door of the diner, and she understood that the diner was not her territory. It was his. She had walked in as the buyer, and she was now sitting across from the only person who could stop her project from moving forward, and she had done it in a place where the coffee cost $1.50 and the waitress knew his name. Jack did not raise his voice when he explained the situation. He spoke the way he spoke to Sophie when she asked how an engine worked, which was to say that he spoke in facts that were laid out in an order that made the conclusion unavoidable. He told Victoria that the secondary unit sat on a separate parcel that had been deeded to him personally 11 years earlier, and that the deed was recorded at the county clerk's office in a file that had nothing to do with the garage lease. The unit contained 8 documented heritage coachwork pieces, and the Preservation Board had opened a preliminary registry file based on his photographs and his provenance documentation. If the board proceeded to a formal designation, all demolition and rezoning permits on the block would be frozen for the duration of the review, and that review could take between 6 and 18 months. Victoria listened without interrupting, which Jack understood was not a sign of agreement, but a sign that she was recording everything for later analysis. She sat very still, and her eyes stayed on his face, and Jack knew that she was trying to find the weakness in his story. She was looking for the exaggeration, or the lie, or the gap that her legal team could exploit. She did not find it, because Jack was not exaggerating. He was a man who had spent 11 years looking at metal and knowing when it was sound, and he knew that his claim was as sound as the frame rails on the Chevrolet. She asked one question when he finished. She asked if he was aware that her company had legal teams that could challenge any preservation designation as frivolous, and that she had the resources to keep such a challenge active for longer than he could afford to wait. Jack told her that he was aware. He also told her that her investors were not aware and that he had spoken to 2 of them the previous afternoon, finding them through public filings and calling their offices to leave messages that were polite, factual, and impossible to ignore. He had ended each call by saying that he was not looking to delay their project indefinitely, but to finish a conversation that someone else had started. Victoria's face changed. The controlled mask slipped, and for a moment, Jack saw the person beneath the title. She was afraid. But it was not the fear of physical harm. It was the fear of a timeline unraveling and the fear of a board meeting where she would have to explain that a single storage unit had been overlooked by a survey team that she had personally approved. Jack recognized that fear because he had felt it himself when he watched his crew leave. She tried to recover, straightening her coat and picking up her phone, and she said that this was a negotiation and that every negotiation had a price. She asked him what he wanted, and she asked it in the tone of a woman who was prepared to write a check that would make the problem disappear. Jack looked at her, and he looked at the key on the table, and he told her that he did not want her money. He wanted her attention. He wanted her to understand that the men she had fired in 48 hours were not equipment that could be cleared. They were fathers, and they were workers, and they were people who had built something that she had never bothered to look at. She leaned forward, and her voice dropped to a level that she probably used in conference rooms when she wanted to convey urgency without volume. She said that time was her enemy now, and that every day of delay cost her project money that he couldn't imagine. She said that she was prepared to be generous, but that generosity had a limit, and that he was approaching it. Jack listened, and he understood that she was still trying to measure him by his clothes and his hands. She was still assuming that a man who repaired cars for a living couldn't imagine large sums, and she was still wrong. He simply knew that large sums were not what the situation required. Victoria stared at him, having not expected a speech about fathers and workers. She had expected a number, and the absence of a number confused her more than the presence of a threat would have. She tried again. She said that she could offer a considerable sum for the unit and its contents, and that she could have a cashier's check drawn by the end of the business day. She said he could walk out of the diner with more money than he would have made in 5 years at the garage, and that all he had to do was sign the release and hand her the key. She spoke quickly, and her words ran together the way they did when she was pitching to a room full of people who were already convinced. She was trying to reframe the situation as a transaction, because transactions were her native language, and she believed that every language could be translated into money if you found the right number. Jack did not touch the key. He asked her if she knew the names of the men she had fired. She hesitated before answering, and the hesitation was the answer. He named them: Marcus, Eli, Dave, and Colton. Jack named them, and he watched Victoria's eyes, and he saw that she did not recognize a single one. "These are not abstract people," Jack said. "They're the men who worked in the garage you called dirty and noisy. They showed up every morning because they had families to feed, and they left because you decided that the block was underperforming. I'm not here to make you feel guilty. Guilt isn't a currency I can spend. I'm here to tell you that if you want to move your project forward, you will need to deal with them as directly as you're dealing with me. You will need to reinstate their contracts, or find them equivalent work, or explain to your investors why a project that was supposed to break ground in March is now waiting on a preservation review that you could have avoided by walking through a door that was 10 feet from your surveyor's clipboard." Victoria's composure cracked further. She set her phone down harder than she intended, and the screen lit up with a notification that she did not check. She said that this was not how business worked. She said that market forces were not personal and that she couldn't be held responsible for the economic realities of a development project. Her voice rose, and the waitress looked over, and Jack shook his head, and Ruth turned back to the counter. Victoria noticed the exchange, and it stopped her. She realized that the waitress had seen Jack's authority before she had, and that the diner was not her territory. It was his. She tried to recover the tone she had used when she walked in. She said that she would have her legal team review the preservation filing, and that she would find a way to proceed with or without his cooperation. She said it with the confidence of a woman who had never been in a position where money was not the answer, and Jack understood that confidence because he had seen it before. He had seen it from customers who believed that a large tip could buy forgiveness for a small insult, and he had seen it from people who thought that the price of a repair was the price of the mechanic's dignity. He did not resent her for it. He simply knew that she was speaking a language he had never learned, and that he was about to teach her the only language he knew. Jack waited until she finished, then reached into his other pocket and placed a third item on the table. It was a folded document, a copy of the letter he had sent to the preservation board. The letter stated that he was the owner of the secondary unit, that he supported the formal designation, and that he had no intention of selling the unit to any entity associated with the redevelopment of the block. He had sent a copy to her investors as well, but he had not done it to threaten. He had done it because a man who tells the truth to the right people doesn't need to threaten anyone. He had done it because the truth was the only tool he had ever trusted, and because he had learned a long time ago that a lie might get you through the day, but it wouldn't get you through the frame. Victoria picked up the document and unfolded it. She read it quickly, and Jack could see her scanning for the loophole. She did not find it. The language was plain, and the intent was clear. He had done it once, done it right, and done it in a way that no one could undo. Victoria set the document down and looked at Jack for a long moment. The look was not friendly, but it was no longer dismissive. It was the look of a person who was reassessing the dimensions of a room she had thought she understood. She asked him what he wanted, and this time she did not ask it in the tone of a woman writing a check. She asked it in the tone of a person who had run out of options, and Jack could hear the difference. It was the same difference he heard in an engine when a misfire stopped being intermittent and became constant. It was the sound of a problem that was no longer hiding. Jack told her that he wanted the crew reinstated as independent contractors on the new development, at union wages, with contracts that ran for the life of the project. He wanted the secondary unit preserved as a community workshop and museum space with public access and a budget for maintenance. He wanted the main garage lease transferred back to him at a fair market rate for the duration of the redevelopment, so that the men who had been fired could continue to work in the space where they had built their skills. He told her that no cash needed to pass between them because the payment he was looking for was not financial. It was structural. It was the kind of structure that couldn't be demolished in 48 hours, and it was the kind of structure that would outlast her project by decades if it was built correctly. He told her that the crew had not failed a performance covenant. The building had failed a performance covenant, and the building was not the crew. He told her that if she wanted to build something new on the block, she would need to build it with the people who had already been building there, because they were the ones who knew where the pipes ran and where the concrete had settled. Victoria listened, and she did not argue. She understood that he was not asking for a bribe. He was asking for a correction, and the correction was public. These terms were visible, and they were tied to her permits, and they were non-negotiable because Jack had made them non-negotiable by telling the truth to everyone who mattered before he walked into the diner. He had removed the possibility of a backroom deal by making the room itself the deal, and she was sitting in it. Victoria stared at him. She thought about her investors, and she thought about the preservation board, and she thought about the fact that Jack had already sent his letter before he walked into the diner. She understood that he had not come here to threaten her. He had come here to finish, and finishing meant that she had to either accept his terms or explain to her board why a 48-hour eviction had turned into a 12-month delay. She did not like the answer, but she recognized it. She took the pen that Jack handed her. It was a ballpoint from his shirt pocket, and the clip was dark with grease, and she looked at it for a moment before she signed the letter of intent that Linda had drawn up. She signed it on the diner table, and Ruth walked past with a coffee pot and did not look down. And the signature was small and tight, and it covered the page in a way that made it real. Jack did not celebrate. He simply folded the letter and put it in his pocket next to the key that was no longer necessary, and he finished his coffee. The cup was empty, and the diner was quiet, and the transaction was complete in a way that neither of them had expected when they sat down. Victoria left the diner without finishing her water. She stood, smoothed her coat, and walked to the door with the same posture she had used when she walked in, though Jack could see that the posture was costing her more now than it had before. She did not look back. She pushed through the door and stepped into the sunlight, and the silver sedan was still idling in the lot, and she climbed into the back seat and closed the door with a sound that was softer than Jack expected. He stayed in the booth. He picked up the pen she had used, wiped the grease off the clip, and put it back in his pocket. He left a $5 bill on the table for Ruth, which was more than the coffee cost, and he walked out to his truck with the letter of intent folded in his shirt pocket. He stopped at the light where Sophie usually fell asleep, and she was already drowsy against the passenger window. He thought about the letter in his pocket, and he thought about the fact that Victoria Cross would spend the evening on the phone with her lawyers, and that her lawyers would tell her what she already knew. There was no loophole and no threat to counter. There was only a man who had told the truth to the right people, and a daughter who was sleeping because her father had come home. He drove back to the secondary unit. The door was still open from the morning, and the late afternoon light came through the high windows and landed on the tarps in long rectangles that made the dust look like smoke. Sophie was waiting outside, sitting on the step with her backpack and a drawing she had made at the neighbor's house. She stood up when she saw his truck, and she ran to him, and he lifted her the way he always did, with his hands under her arms and his forearms taking the weight so that his grease-stained fingers did not touch her coat. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and Jack held her for a moment longer than usual, because the day had been long and the victory had been quiet. "Are we staying?" she asked. Jack looked at the tarps, and he looked at the light, and he looked at his daughter. "Some things don't get cleared away," he said. "They just get covered until someone remembers to look." Sophie nodded. She did not fully understand, but she trusted him in the wordless, complete way that children trust the people who have never once given them a reason not to. Jack carried her inside, and they sat on the edge of the 1954 Chevrolet frame, and she handed him her drawing. It showed the garage with the bay doors open, and the sign above them, and 4 men standing under a car with wheels that looked like suns. Jack folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, next to the letter and the pen, and he sat with his daughter in the quiet until the light moved off the tarps and the dust settled back into darkness. He thought about the fact that Sophie had drawn 4 men under the car, and that she had remembered them exactly. That was the picture he would keep, because it was the one that mattered. Subscribe to Dad Legacy Justice, because some things don't need to be said, they only need to be done. And the next time someone tells you that the world moves too fast to notice what you have built, remember that the things people overlook are usually the things that matter most.